resume, he graduated from the Tufts University and got a PhD in international relations from the Fletcher School. And he has been working for Congressional Research Service for more than 16 years. And I think he has been most prudent and sometimes conservative, but viewed generally very objective observer of ROK U.S. relations for the past 16 years. And his analysis is always reliable. And we are lucky to have him today because he's now visiting professors of national universities. And Professor Park Chul-hee, he brought him over here. And therefore it was very interesting for us to have a very direct discussions with him. And as he made clear that today's speech should be off the record, or you can apply Chetham's rule, don't attribute his name, and then you can still talk about it. But you can use his speech as a kind of basis for your this thesis or writing papers or writing articles. And also we have a very today is we have a very distinguished guest here. And as you all know, our chairman of East Asia Foundation is Minister Gong Nam-myung, and also we are very lucky to have a former president of Korea University, Lee Gi-soo. First time he's showing up here. And we have Ambassador Alonso from Panama. He has been very active leader among the foreign diplomatic corps in Seoul. And also now we have Chun-ye, the Honorable Chun-ye, member of the National Assembly from the opposition party. But she has been attending our luncheon speech without any interruption for the past 3 or 4. And she has been very active member of East Asia Foundation. She attended a conference in Washington, gave a presentation, and etc. And also, as usual, we have all these German stiftings, Adenauer, Naumann, and Friedrich Ebert. I don't know why you Germans are so interested in our event. But anyhow, I thank you. Danke schön. And also, you all know we have a new face here too, the Toby Suk, the once very notorious senior press secretary for President Roh Moo-hyun, but he's a very renowned political scientist in Korea. Very few people know that. A lot of people remember her as competent, politically competent, but she's one of the leading scholars in rational choice theory of political science. And therefore, she has a great reputation in the United States. I don't know why she's known as a political fighter in Korea, but she's a very respected scholar. And also we have a deputy chief of mission from Vietnamese embassy here. And so many other stuff, our speakers. Okay. And now, Mark, you will have about 30-minute talks, okay, and that will be followed by about 50-minute question and answers in a very usual way of conducting this luncheon seminar. Farah.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Moon. And thank you all for coming here. I will try to keep you awake after your lunch. And I should say also that thank you to the East Asia Foundation. The Global Asia publication has just been a terrific resource to me and many of my colleagues over the years. You just do a terrific job of getting different voices to speak on different issues.
Thank you.
So thank you for doing that.
Thank you so much.
Let's see. So Professor Moon asked me he asked me to come speak, and I said, what should I talk about? He said, just pick something provocative, have a provocative title. So I said, okay, and it was late at night, and so I whipped this off. And so, of course, I think we all know and appreciate how strong U.S.-South Korea relations are, and they have been for quite some time. So I said, well, let's just look at some of the, I don't want to say dark side, but some of the clouds that are looming and see if there are any that could, and that's natural that this would be in any relationship. A Japanese friend of mine, he's serving in the Gaimsho in the Japanese Foreign Ministry, and he's a China expert. And he came to D.C. a few years ago and was there for about 3 years before, and then he was summoned back to go back to Beijing. And I said, oh, so you must be, disappointed that you're going to Beijing because your job will be a lot harder there. He said, no. He said, working in China is easy. He said, dealing with your rivals is easy because everybody knows what you're going to say and you don't really have to do very much. But working here in D.C. has been hard because the expectations are so high. And I think that's that's the case here in the U.S.-South Korea relationship. Dan Pinkston and I were just talking that if you step back and look, things look really good. But if you get into the details of anything, particularly for people who are working in the two foreign ministries or the defense departments, things get more difficult. So I want to look at what issues might become more problematic over the next 2 years or so. Before I do that, I should note one thing, since we have some representatives from the Vietnamese embassy here, that as we speak, there's a very historic event going on. For the first time ever, the General Secretary of the Vietnamese Communist Party is going to the United States, Nguyen Phu Trong. I cover U.S. relations with the Koreas, with Japan, and also with Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam. So the last month or so, I spent a lot of time answering questions from Congress about U.S.-Vietnam relations, and in particular this visit. And I think it's just a symbol of what's happening in terms of U.S. foreign policy in Southeast Asia in general and Vietnam in particular. And I'll get into that a little bit later. My remarks are going to be kind of all over the place. I apologize for that. But we'll see if it all comes together. Hopefully it will. So as I mentioned, U.S.-South Korean relations are particularly strong these days. And they have been basically since 2009, 2008, 2009. And what cemented that is a common view on how to deal with North Korea since that time. Basically since President Lee took office, and also since the collapse of the six-party talks as well. Alliance coordination has been exceptionally good. Both sides, again, this stretches back to the Lee government, but both sides have been working quite a lot to avoid negatives when they have popped up, to keep them contained, and have successfully worked through many issues that could have been problematic. Delay of OPCON transfer, operational control, renegotiation of the special measures agreement, for example. These could have been quite problematic, but again, were negotiated not without difficulty, but really contained. The bilateral civilian nuclear agreement that was just signed earlier this year is another great example of how the Park Geun-hye government came in. They took what was starting to become a much more difficult issue and really diffused it. And I think the two governments deserve credit for working out a compromise that satisfied both sides, although we could get into more details on that if you'd like. But the bottom line is they kept what could have been a volatile issue and contained it and managed it, and were able to get an agreement that satisfies both sides. So the question is, how can this continue, or how long can this continue? And in general, I'm pretty optimistic, in part because the trust between the two governments right now seems to be fairly solid. But there are some areas that are looming, I think, that could be problematic. And I would identify three of them. One is TPP. The other is this whole set of regional developments. And the other is domestic politics, particularly here in South Korea. Notice I don't mention North Korea, even though I think Park Geun-hye clearly is going to be looking for a legacy issue as she enters the last half of her term. She is more willing to engage with North Korea than most people in Washington are, certainly. But I think it seems like there's an agreement, an understanding, at least among most people in the Obama administration, that they are going to let South Korea take the lead on any engagement policies because they have enough trust in the Park government that these engagement initiatives are going to be relatively modest, and ultimately that, unlike, say, during the Nongbyon era, that that she is going to put the nuclear issue, she's going to make that a priority and link large-scale assistance, for example, to developments on the nuclear issue. I could be wrong on that, but that's how I see that so far. If there's any risk on North Korea, I think actually it might, or any risk of that becoming a problematic issue, I think it might be that people in Seoul might be concerned that the mood in Washington is getting too hard on North Korea. And there the winds are definitely blowing towards adopting more restrictions, tighter sanctions and broader sanctions on North Korea over the coming year. And it will be interesting when Park Geun-hye presumably eventually reschedules her trip to Washington. It's possible that she comes in the late fall, for example, that there might be a move in Congress to expand sanctions. She could land right in the middle of that debate, and that could create some awkward circumstances for her. It might not go anywhere, or it might take some time to develop. Anyway, we could talk more about that if you have questions in general. So other issues that I think are more likely to be problematic. First, an easy one is TPP, or a short one. And here, again, timing may sort of play an interesting role. You know, if Park Geun-hye comes to Washington in, say, the mid to late fall, this could be at a time when we've possibly finalized a TPP agreement, but it has not yet reached Congress yet. As some of you may know, in the United States, in general, and in this TPA that was just passed, Trade Promotion Authority, there is a 90-day review period after a trade agreement is signed, and then Congress has those, and the public have those 90 days to review it. So Park Geun-hye could presumably come right during that interim period, which could create an interesting set of circumstances, because I know there are some people in the Korean government who want to get into TPP and be a founding member. The United States has said no. We need to complete the agreement first before we will open it up to new members. So instead, what some in the government want to do, I believe, is to sort of come in during that period between the time the agreement is reached and the time that various parliaments have ratified it. And so she could come in perfectly poised to push South Korea's interest there. The one problem I see is that the United States actually could push back because the United States is almost certainly going to have some demands that the Park government, like any South Korean government, would not want to just accept, and so there will be some bitter negotiations going on. And this, of course, might generate some negative press. Here we have some people from Yonhap with a lot of leaks going on as particularly the South Korean government tries to put the Obama administration in their position in a negative light. So I think this could generate some difficulties. It could also generate some difficulties between Korea-Japan relations, which I'll get to in a minute. So that's one thing that could come up. And also, I should add that this is likely to come up regardless of when Park Geun-hye goes to Washington. If there is a final TPP agreement and South Korea wants to join, the United States is not going to just say, "Okay, please come in." At a certain stage, yes, this is a strategic agreement, but before that stage, American negotiators are going to. It's going to be in the hands of the trade negotiators, not the foreign policy folks. So they're going to treat it as a trade negotiation and treat it just as hard and negotiate just as hard as they did the Chorus FTA. So looking at regional issues, let's start with Japan. So here I think we see mixed signals. On the one hand, relations have sort of stabilized, although clearly they remain quite tense, and I think the whole debate over these UNESCO sites just symbolizes that quite a bit. One thing I will say is that I've been impressed at the amount of restraint that both governments have had over the last year. Park Geun-hye is clearly making a bigger priority on improving the relations. And I have to say that I think, and this might be a little controversial in this room, but the Prime Minister Abe has been relatively restrained since he went to Yasukuni Shrine. That he, while clearly his government and even his family members have taken some very provocative acts, things that upset Americans as well as Koreans, but in general, he himself has avoided taking or saying the most flagrant or obvious things that would really provoke a strong reaction. So no more trips to Yasukuni, for example. He, in a way, has been forced to adopt the Kono statement and the Murayama statement. So, in a way, you could say that the combination of U.S. and South Korean pressure, I don't know if it's coordinated, but clearly there's some unspoken cooperation at a minimum, that they have forced Abe to take positions or not do things that he would want to do ordinarily. And in a way, he's been rewarded by this because it's forced South Korea to change its position on Japan. But looking forward, it's unclear whether either government in Tokyo or Seoul are going to make this relationship a priority. I'm kind of doubtful. And so I think that means that the status quo is going to continue, which is both sides don't want to, do anything major that would upset the other one, but at the same time they're not going to have a breakthrough. Again, I could be wrong on that, and maybe there'll be something that will happen over the next few weeks, but I'd be surprised. The problem for South Korea-U.S. relations is that, as we saw from Prime Minister Abe's visit in April, is that largely because of regional trends, the U.S. is pretty much fully on board with Prime Minister Abe's agenda. TPP, of course, there are problems in the negotiation, but just the fact that he's brought Japan into the TPP is a big win for the United States, or at least the Obama administration. And the U.S., of course, fully supports Prime Minister Abe's security agenda on what he wants to do to expand the scope of Japanese military action. So as long as Prime Minister Abe avoids taking the most flagrant or upsetting actions and words on history, I think the pressure from the U.S. is going to be mainly on the Blue House. Again, I think this is, in some ways, this should be a sign of success that the U.S. and South Korea have put Abe into a box, if you will, somewhat to constrain his words and actions. And especially after he went to Congress, he gave this speech. It was very well received to American ears, particularly to American congressmen's ears. He said lots of good things on history issues. So if he goes against that somehow, the sense of betrayal will be quite strong, I think, from many members of Congress and from the administration as well. And I sense that people in the Kante, in the Prime Minister's office, they understand this well. And so that, in a way, will increase the pressure on Abe also to not do something wrong. That said, he probably won't commit an offense, but it's what he doesn't say that many people will be focusing on. But again, I think that's a different type of dynamic than actually committing something by saying something wrong or going to Yasukuni, taking an action like that. But so the bottom line is, I think that U.S.-South Korean tensions over Japan will continue over the next year. And as the U.S.-Japan partnership continues to expand and evolve, this will just become more problematic. Some things that I'm keeping an eye on, as I think many of us are what is the 70th anniversary statement that Prime Minister Abe is going to make? What is that going to say? Is there going to be a China-Japan-Korea summit coming up? And also TPP. And in TPP, South Korea's road to TPP has to go through Tokyo. And it's hard to believe that the Abe government will not let's put it this way. If there is not a summit, it's hard to believe that the Abe government will be very willing to do favors for South Korea. So I think there'll have to be some sort of change. I mean, not that they're willing to do any favors for South Korea these days, anyway, but that will be even less so unless there's some sort of summit. In other words, it's fully. I don't think it would surprise any of us if there's a price, a political or diplomatic price that Japan poses for South Korea to give permission or give Japanese blessing for South Korea to come into TPP. Looking around the region now, China is another area that I think we've all been focusing on, particularly all the focus on THAAD, on missile defense. I think these kinds of issues are only likely to get more frequent, more numerous, and worse. American policymakers are becoming more and more comfortable with competition and rivalry with China. And in a way, I think there's a growing belief that if relations with China are too good, then it means that we're not doing something right, because China is posing such a challenge in so many ways, in so many different fields to the United States, that politically, if nothing else, the administration and Congress has to respond to that. I'm not saying that's right, I'm saying that's the feeling. So, again, the bottom line is that American policymakers are feeling like there has to be a healthy amount of rivalry and competition and contentiousness in this bilateral relationship. And for some East Asian countries, that's okay, Japan in particular. But for others, that level of contention is not, the United States is farther out than they are, or more comfortable than they are. And South Korea, of course, is one of those, I think. If the situation in the South China Sea worsens, I think the United States, the administration in general, and also people in Congress are going to be looking for how U.S. allies and partners are responding to that, and more questions are being asked about South Korea's position on the South China Sea, and asking why isn't South Korea saying more to criticize China, for example. Again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's part of the dynamic here. South Korea obviously, has some special issues when it comes to maritime security. When it comes to land reclamation, if South Korea speaks too loudly about what China is doing, China can also point to EODO and Korean steps there. Likewise, the whole South Korea's position on the northern limit line with North Korea can also might create some complications or compromise what South Korea can say about the South China Sea. But most American policymakers won't understand that, and they'll be looking for something more from South Korea. Likewise, Russia. Russia's an interesting case because, of course, the United States, now with all this attention on the Iran deal, the Obama administration has had to step back from being so overtly, anti-Russian a bit. Depending on what happens with the Iran deal, that may shift back. And if the situation on Ukraine does not remain somewhat stable, then more attention could be paid on what South Korea is doing with Russia. Although I think here most of the focus is going to be on Japan, and it looks pretty clear that the Abe government is determined to bring Putin to Russia. And if I were giving this talk in Tokyo, that Japan-Russia relations would be kind of right at the top of areas that could be problematic for the relationship. So let me say a few words about politics. It's clear that Park Geun-hye, is entering. She's past the 2.5-year mark, or just right up against it. And traditionally, that's the lame duck period. She seems to have entered it about a year early because of the Sewol disaster, of course. I'm struck, this trip to Seoul, I'm struck by the amount of despair that people seem to be saying, friends of mine seem to be saying about the Park Geun-hye government. So that lame duck period, I think it started a little earlier, and it seems to be deeper than in previous years. Again, I could be wrong. I'm only talking to a few people, so I'm interested if you feel that way too. And so, of course, that just makes things more politicized as well. Any issue that becomes a potential problem between the U.S. and South Korea, it means that the Blue House is less likely to be able to control the press in particular, and also the National Assembly as well. There are going to be voices that want to be heard because of next year's legislative elections and the following year's presidential elections. One question I have for you all is, how the opposition candidates, who we don't, unfortunately, we just don't hear much about many opposition members, their feelings about U.S. and U.S. foreign policy these days. So I'm curious if how much of a shift there's been in thinking about trade agreements, specifically TPP, about Japan relations, South Korea-Japan relations, South Korea-China relations, and North Korea. But if those progressive voices start becoming louder, and if they haven't shifted from what Moon Jae-in basically was articulating 3 years ago, then that could create problems, of course, for the U.S. and South Korea as well. It strikes me, I haven't been, so in the, I guess how many Korean presidential elections have I followed? Like 4 now, the last 4? It seemed, my quick impression is that there's much more uncertainty this time around than we've had in a long, long time, just not knowing who the likely candidates are from either camp. And again, I haven't been studying South Korean politics for that long, but I don't recall this much uncertainty in a while. And in fact, in planning, a next trip to South Korea, hopefully later this year, some colleagues and I were trying to think, okay, we should try and get in and talk to some presidential candidates, and or potential presidential candidates, and other than Park Won-soon, it's not so easy to identify who we should meet again. So, any suggestions? Welcome that. So, some questions I have for you, because this is a good opportunity for me to gather information. Other than sort of where the progressive camp is. I know we have a member from the National Assembly, so I'll put you on the spot, Ms. Chu, maybe. But what your feelings are about South Korea's position on maritime issues, particularly in the South China Sea, and if the Obama administration starts looking to South Korea to say or do more, what your feelings about that would be. And also in general, the whole situation with Japan and China just makes me question whether, whether the basic orientation of South Korean foreign policy. And for the last several years, South Korea has tried to be kind of a middle power, creating a network of relationships that would basically increase its leverage and also reduce its vulnerability to great power intervention. And I just wonder, I'm starting to think that as the relationship between China and the United States, and Japan and the United States starts to get more tense and more, that really reduces South Korea's freedom for action. So I just wonder whether this whole middle power thesis becomes much more difficult if you have sort of a mini Cold War type situation in East Asia. I haven't gotten any firm answers on that in my own mind. I'm just working that through. It's something that a lot of people, not a lot, but a few of us are talking about in D.C. now. So let me stop there. Hopefully I'll do something unusual and finish a little early.
Okay, let's give you a applause.